To start my speech, like my first two debater friends have, I'll be giving a list of thanks. I'd like to thank my parents and family who've all been supportive to me and helped me foster my interest for debate. My friends back at school, and as well as all the other policy debaters at this tournament, you guys were great. Thanks for making us have such a memorable season. I'd like to thank the entire West Lafayette debate team. You guys have all been supportive, every category, Congress included. And I'd like to thank specifically our policy team, Katie and Hila. You guys are going to do really well next year. Thanks, Brian and Gloria. I understand that you guys are disappointed that you didn't make nationals, but things happen. And I'd like to thank Ben, my partner at camp. We had a lot of fun together at camp. Hitting heads against each other. Adam, my former partner during the space topic, and John, my current partner, for having to deal with me screaming at people. And I'd like to thank all the judges that judged for us today. We couldn't be here without you. And I'd like to thank Koala Bear again. You're awesome, and you've basically made us what we are today. I'd also like to thank Water. It's our half case. It also helps me going around. And I'd also like to thank the mastermind behind our entire team, Mr. Smith. I love you, Mr. Smith. You're awesome. All right, now let us begin. For a brief roadmap, I'll be starting off with topicality, moving on to the politics dissent, solvency, and then going down to three advantages. Everyone ready? Comments? Partner? All right, let us begin. On topicality, we aren't an environmental treaty. We specifically invest in infrastructure. Also, they don't define what is environmental or not. They come up here and just say, hey, you guys aren't environmental because we said so. So they bite their own teeth. Also, it counter-interp. Economic engagement includes cross-border investment, McCann in 2013. In the modern era of globalization, international economic engagement is as much about increasing cross-border investment and engagement as it is about changes in gross or net exports and imports. The plan is joint investment with Mexico, so it meets our definition. Water is a commodity, and the Rio Grande is a resource that literally ties our nations together. Also, water is a commodity, Fisher in 2011. Water is a unique commodity because nothing else can substitute for it. Indeed, nothing is as universal and as necessary as water. Because it is needed for virtually everything we produce and consume, its availability and its price are crucial to the global economy and to the livelihood of the world's population. So by our interpretation, any type of cross-border investment on a natural resource is topical. Cases which would include oil, natural minerals, as well as water. Now moving on to the politics dissent, we don't manage water rights. We're specifically a water infrastructure case. We also don't give people water because we don't manage water rights. Also, we make Texas happier as the entire river gains more water. As the 1AC stated, Texas is also being affected by the drought. Also, against their uniqueness, no hope to pass minimum wage, AP 130. The Democratic push to boost federal minimum wage is a long shot. There's a suspense over the outcome. Few expect Democrats to muster the 60 votes needed to showdown in the Senate roll call that the Majority Leader, Harry Reid, wants minimum wage by early March. Even if they do, the Republican-run House rejected a similar plan last year, and it seems unlikely to visit the issue soon. This is tacked onto the immigration reform advantage dissent. Also, immigration reform won't pass in 2014. Mohammed in December of 2013. It is difficult to see immigration reform emerging, not least since the white right is adamantly opposed to immigration reform. Since they see it will bring more Latinos and Asians into the country. Also, on solvency, all of their attacks on irrigation don't apply to us because we oblige with Senate Amendment 1049, the Library of Congress in 2013. The Secretary may not provide payments to a producer for water conservation or irrigation practice under this subsection unless the producer agrees not to use any associated water savings to bring new land other than incidental land needed for the efficient operations under irrigated production, unless the producer is participating in a watershed-wide project that will effectively conserve water as determined by the Secretary. So because we follow this, none of their arguments about people buying land affect our case. On top, moving on, Texas, we don't sacrifice any water for our case. We just increase the total amount of water that is flowing down the river. So that has absolutely nothing to do with our case. Moving on to advantage one, agriculture. Their attacks on irrigation, we replace the current form of irrigation. We don't plan out entire irrigation networks over the Mexico and the United States. We put it where the old irrigation was or wherever the farmers wanted. Also, I would like to extend all of the impacts of Advantage 1, as well as tack on additional impacts to erosion. Pimentel and Burgess in 2013. Most of the U.S. cropland is losing soil faster than soil formation can replace it. Soil erosion is severe in the most productive agricultural ecosystems in the United States. Yearly, many valuable hectares of cropland are abandoned after they become unproductive due to wind and water erosion. So they brought up an erosion argument in the last speech. They specifically stated due to deforestation. We don't increase agriculture from beyond where it is right now, so we don't link. But on top of that, we solve for erosion using the new irrigation systems. As the 1AC stated, we save 70% water, and we help stop erosion with this advantage. So moving on to advantage to invasive species, they requested that we bring up evidence on a control for, or a solvency advocate for salt cedar. Biological controls solve for salt cedar. Johnson et al., University of Nevada, 2002. The biological control applies to natural enemies to weed. Insects have all been used in successful biological control. 2 insects, a mealy bug and a leaf beetle, have been released in the United States to attack salt cedar, after it was established that it only eats salt cedar and not valuable natives or crops. So we enable this so we can get rid of this salt cedar, which in turn allows Mexico to release its water, which it cannot right now because the Rio Conchos is completely blocked by the salt cedar. On top of that, pull through the 1AC argument that removing invasive species in the river saves 25% more water. This outweighs any type of water that if you buy the negatives argument, that we waste implementing these new irrigation systems. But on top of that, these new irrigation systems are the most efficient on the market right now. That's why we implement them. Now moving on to Advantage 3 Water Wars, we aren't doing modeling, so that attack is non-responsive to our case. And also what we're specifically trying to solve for is the Mennonite-Mexican conflict that is occurring in the northern regions of Mexico right now. The root cause of that water war is the drought. Conflict between Mexican and Mennonites over water war began in 2012. For the past 9 decades, the relations between the Mennonites and the Mexicans have been largely amicable, in part because of the little direct interaction between the Mennonite enclaves, in part because the Mennonite agriculture has boosted the regional economy, and in part due to an all-Mennonite productivity and the intense work ethic. The modest, unassuming Pacific behavior of the Mexican Mennonites has also won the respect of the Chihuahuanese. Over the last year, however, the traditional Mennonite, non-Mennonite coexistence has started to shatter. As the Mennonite colonies have expanded to previously uncultivated areas of the state, the proliferation of hundreds of deep wells for irrigation is rapidly depleting aquifers and basins as neighboring farmers and ranchers see the yield of their shallower wells dramatically diminish. So as we can clearly see by this water wars card, the biggest problem right now in the region is the Mexican Mennonites, who have recently decided to take initiatives to deplete all the aquifers in the midst of this crisis that is the drought. Now I understand that the negative team has said that we can't solve for the drought, and yes, that is true, but by increasing saving 70% more water on all irrigation and increasing the net water flow in the river by 25%, we can easily reverse all the effects of the drought by essentially replenishing the entire water system, which would be then able to solve for Advantage 1 agriculture, which enables all the farmers to grow the crops that they needed. The Advantage 2 species also helps solve that problem. And Advantage 3 Water Wars, the root cause, which is drought. Also pulled through the card from the 1AC that my partner stated about how specifically, because of the recent drought, farmers have been going out of business, they've been losing their will, and therefore they've been increasing drug violence. None of this was attacked in the round. So if you look at the advantages standing in the round, we still have death and suffering from agriculture, death and suffering from disease due to the dengue fever. Even if mosquitoes exist in other places, as I said, if mosquitoes exist in other places, we still help solve it by getting rid of the species directly on the Rio Grande. And lastly, for Advantage 3 Water Wars, people are actually shooting each other right now. People are joining these drug cartels. We'll be able to prevent this, and we'll be able to promote a new era of peace within the region. For all those reasons, I can only say an affirmative ballot. I'm now ready for cross-examination.
So if everyone's ready then, let's begin. So starting out, talking about those Mennonites. So you're saying that they're depleting aquifers due to wells that they're drilling, right?
No, they're just, well, yeah.
All right, so they're depleting the aquifers through wells. How do you deal with them doing that if all you're doing is making them use better irrigation?
Well, no. The thing is, even if they're depleting the aquifers and through wells, by increasing the total water supply by 25%, regardless of how much they're using, we'll still be able to see a net benefit as everybody now has water. So 25% is a huge amount.
How can you say that regardless of any amount, all you're doing is increasing it by 25%?
The entire net flow of the river by 25%.
Yeah,
There's
so you
thousands
literally
of
just
gallons of
said
water.
any amount. What
No.
if it was like 50% more than that?
But the Mexican Mennonites are concentrated within the northern Chihuahua region. They can't possibly be, they don't have access to that much water.
And how does the Rio Grande get into these aquifers anyways? Isn't it underground? these aquifers, and
As
the Rio
my
Grande
partner
is above
stated,
ground?
the surface water and the underground aquifers are closely binded. They move back and forth as well as a lot of different things, especially since aquifer recharge comes out of irrigation as well as rain and things like that.
All right. Did you have any specific evidence as to how the river flowing better would actually lead to it seeping into the aquifers?
Well, as we
would a
stated,
faster flowing river actually run by it
well,
faster?
all we're doing, as we said with the pre-drought conditions, that's basically what we're doing to the river itself. We're trying to restore the river to the pre-drought conditions so we can solve for these conflicts. If it weren't for the drought, there wouldn't be these problems anymore.
All right. And then for politics, you said that you're not managing water rights, so you don't link, and that Texas would like your plan because they would give you water.
Yeah, Texas needs more water. Your court
All right.
said that.
And then you said that you talked about minimum wage not passing.
Yeah, it's part of the immigration reform bill.
It is.
It'll come back to the. It'll come back to the.
Where does it say that minimum wage is part of immigration
I
reform?
have other questions.
All right. And as for the topicality, you said that for the first interpretation we brought up, that basically it's just that you're not environmental. Did you have any cards about that specifically?
Well, we're specifically investing in infrastructure. You had absolutely no cards or anything that defined what environmental is or not. You just said you were.
All right. Did you have a response to our second interpretation, or did you just bring up a counter interpretation?
Yeah, that was our counter.
All right. Did you respond to our standards, voters?
I mean, yeah, we cross-applied the same thing because, as I said before, when you didn't define what it is environmental or not, you bit your own teeth.
How did we bite our own teeth? The name doesn't have to be topical, does it?
When you bring up the standards of limits and fairness, and you just say you're not you're environmental because we said so, that's not fair at all.
So it's not fair to try and hold you to some kind of limiting factor in this
Without
round?
without any warrants to back you up, no.
All right.
Yes, please.
We got 416 left.
All right, okay.
We got 348 left.
All right, so I'll try to keep this brief. You can extend everything my partner said on the thank you issue. First of all, I got to thank my family for being really supportive. Obviously, my teammates both on the policy team, Brian and Gloria, the deciding round to nationals was decided on one very close ballot. You guys are really good debaters. Mariana and Augustina, you guys are great too. And Katie and Hila are really the future of our policy team, so it's really great to see all of my friends here because they're the reason that we were able to get here as well. I also got to thank my team in general, as everybody else talked about. Congratulations to John and Albert. I'm up here on stage with three of my very best friends, so it's a really nice feeling to be up here today. I got to thank Josh, our assistant coach, Nick Kwalik, who's graduating alongside us, and the impact he's had on this team is just beyond the ability for words to really describe it. So we all really appreciate what Nick has done for this team. And obviously Mr. Smith, my biggest idol. I always appreciate how he values education of his students and principles above success and still manages to succeed. So I really appreciate everybody who's helped me get here today. So as a brief roadmap, we're going to be splitting the block. I'm going to start talking about topicality, then I'll hit solvency, and then I'll hit water wars. The disadvantage and the rest of the advantages will be covered by Adam in the 1 and R. If anybody's not ready, say so now. All right, let's begin. Starting on the environmental interpretation, they said that we didn't define what environmental means, and therefore you should flow this argument out of the round. This is infinitely regressive. At the point where we go up and say you have to be this word, and they say you need to define more specifically what that word is, it's impossible for us to confine them to a certain limit. Obviously, at some point, the judge needs to be reasonable and evaluate whether or not something is environmental. Secondly, our card indicates that these are two distinct, environmental and economic engagement are two distinct areas. You can't be both. So even if they do have economic aspects to their plan, you need to evaluate whether or not they're primarily economic or environmental. Obviously, even though they do use money, the impacts of the plan and the goal of the plan is to sell the environment. So on to their argument about McCann 2013, how it's about cross-border investment. First of all, this card has no intent to define. It's discussing how the economy has changed with globalization. It is not trying to explain the terminology, so you're always going to prefer our interpretation. Second, it has no bright line. In fact, it says what economic engagement is about changes based on present circumstances. It is impossible to evaluate whether or not plans are resolutional under this interpretation. And third, investment most likely means putting money into industries across the border. The app suggests cross-border investment means doing anything that costs money outside of the US. This is not only a misinterpretation of the card, but means that the topic it makes the topic into result. The USFG should do a policy in Cuba, Mexico, or Venezuela. We cannot get ground off of just dealing with Mexico, which is the only predictable ground that they allow us under their interpretation. They also say that water is an economic resource. First of all, water is a social good, IPS 2002. The United Nations issued a statement declaring access to water a human right and saying that water is a social and cultural good, not an economic commodity. Second, their card refers to water from companies as in the water that comes out of the tap, not water in a river, the oceans, or the clouds. That's just absurd. Third, the portrayal of an economic good means that anything that can be bought or sold counts. There's no clear objective delineation. And fourth, even if you buy that they help preserve an economic good, that has nothing to do with the interp debate. Just because their plan is associated with money does not make it economic engagement. On voters, it's a voter for fairness, education, and jurisdiction. They had some embedded clash with our second interpretation, but it wasn't responded to directly. If you don't buy that they're a long-term economic integration, then you vote neg on fairness on that as well. All right, moving on to solvency. First of all, their numbers on how much their plan can solve for, because it's of 1 million a year. They need to be able to show how significant that is, because they have no solvency advocate. They have no card saying we should do this policy at this number. So we don't know how much $1 million can go towards. It is their burden to supply that to you, and you can't vote affirmative until we know the numbers. Adam pressed for this, and they didn't oblige with anything saying how much $1 million can solve for. So we don't know if the plan is significant or has any measurable effect. On the says no argument, this is the first argument talking about how their card only mentioned cooperation, but it doesn't say that Mexico was willing to put the money and effort in to foot the bill. Some more on this. Cooperation with Mexico on water is impossible. The plan is going the wrong direction at a critical juncture. KRGB 13, an ABC News affiliate. Mexico owes the U.S. millions of gallons of water, and state leaders fear they will never see a drop of that debt. Reaganville is the last on the list for water from the Rio Grande. We get our water from them to a reservoir and into the water plant. So obviously there's this great conflict between Mexico, who's not been giving us the water that they owe us by the 1944 treaty they articulate in their inherency attack. You can also cross-apply this to plan unpopular for the politics disadvantage. Secondly, like I said, they haven't proven that $1 million is significant. On the issue of drip irrigation, they didn't answer this turn, which is a really big deal. They might come up and say we talked about surge irrigation, but drip irrigation describes the mechanism for how the water is moved and released. Surge is a system that allows switching across different areas across a farm. So these are really two compatible things. This form of drip irrigation, even though on the surface it seems like it saves more water, it depletes water from ground reservoirs and has a much larger impact on how much it takes away than what it gives. So this turns their entire case as well as turning both of their advantages. Because they were non-responsive to this, you're going to flow that to the negative, and that pretty much destroys them on solvency in an irreversible way. Onto the incentivizing development argument, they try to get out of this by saying that in their plan text they say that we use this law that prevents us from expanding into new land. However, farmers can still cultivate more on existing land that they're not using to the fullest degree, and they can use thirstier crops. Things like rice and corn are not used now as much in the status quo because they take a lot more water than other kinds of crops. If there's more, even if they don't need to expand to the land, they can get more bang for their buck, essentially, in terms of the crops they can actually choose to grow based on how much water they have. So it does increase development, and that does cause a net decrease in water. So that's another trend that still stands despite their argument about lack of expansion. And our alternate cause about deforestation, we weren't saying that the plan causes deforestation, rather we were saying that they can't solve for erosion unless they solve for deforestation, because this is another thing that causes erosion. So if they can't solve for deforestation, then you vote negative on erosion. Another turn on this, irrigation depletes aquifers, reducing the amount of usable land. This is Muir 2012 at Oregon State University. In the US, about 20% of our irrigated agricultural area is watered by pumping in excess of recharge. Texas has lost 14% of its irrigated acreage since 1980 as a result of aquifer depletion. So what this is saying is that irrigation has actually reduced the amount of water that's there permanently in these aquifers, these areas where water is stored underneath the ground. And this is empirically proven, so if there's a war of evidence, our word versus theirs, you'll prefer ours because we have statistical data from Texas, which is a state along the Rio Grande region. In addition, another all-cause argument here, government's cultures and demand to make water problems inevitable no matter what the plan does. See SIS 2005. Problems in governance have created institutions unable to serve the people they represent. Institutional capabilities in many regions have been unable to balance demands across sectors and across boundaries. Social and spiritual values associated with water have complicated and informed management systems and responses. Water-related challenges are leading the world into a period in which fresh water will be a severely limiting factor for the economy, social and political development, and stability of countries and populations across the planet. On one hand, global water challenges are the result of too many people demanding too much water. On the other hand, they are a problem of weak institutions and poor governance. And you can extend what John said in Cross-Sex about how they're not trying to deal with these political issues between Mexico and Texas with our competing interests with this finite resource. That means that that magnifies the emphasis on this all cause. They're not able to solve these governmental and institutional issues that prevent solvency. Moving on to water wars, first, Mennonites don't represent the average farmer. They're just a niche group. There may be problems in the status quo, but it can be contained and managed. They concluded that it won't escalate because they didn't answer a card about how water wars breaking out into an armed conflict is just absurd. So, at the very most, there are a few problems of violence with Mennonites, and cross-supply returns from solvency, even if they create an indirect net decrease that enables conflict further. So for these reasons, I urge a negative ballot, and I now stand open for cross-examination. Yep.
Ready? All right, let's begin. The evidence that you read from this page.
Yeah, some of it I didn't read, but I'll get that to you.
Also, just a question: is a mining case topical?
If it's to mine something to be traded, then sure.
All right, is oil topical?
If it's trading oil, sure. If you don't trade.
So specifically, anything that involves trade is topical.
Well, obviously that's economic by nature because it's in the interest of creating ties between the two countries, imports and exports. It's not about just using money in order to get some non-economic end.
Okay. Also, how is it bad if we make current irrigation systems more important? I believe your cards all state that irrigation is just bad. That's like all it states.
We have multiple arguments both about drip irrigation specifically and about how it creates this new development of agricultural areas. And
well, you specifically said that it's new development, even though if the farms don't expand.
yeah, they don't need to expand the land. They just need to use more of the land or use thirstier crops.
Yeah, how do you use more of the land if you don't expand?
Because if they're not using the land to its fullest because they don't have enough water in the status quo, once they're allowed more water, they're going to use the rest of the land. So it still depletes more water.
Wait, but if there is more overall water, how is that bad if we just
There's-
bring it to its normal state pre?
They're given more water initially, which incentivizes them to use more crops on their land. That use of crops takes away water from the aquifers.
And we don't recharge the aquifers by increasing the water size in our plant, even with the connection that's between the aquifers and the surface water?
our evidence indicates that even though you may add water to these natural reservoirs, it still depletes more than you get.
Where's that evidence?
You can look to the rip turn argument. I don't think I have it up with me, but we can get that to you. If you want.
All right. Also, on your card that talks about how water is a social good, it specifically says that it's not an economic commodity. But reading this card, it says it's not merely an economic commodity. So, what are you getting with this?
Well, you're trying to phrase this in a way that because water can be bought and sold as a commodity, but this is talking about how, first and foremost, it's a non-economic issue. And remember how our evidence talks about how these are in distinct sectors. You can be kind of economic, but the issue is whether or not you're primarily economic, and also it's talking about water that you buy from the water company, not what's in the river.
Wait,
Obviously, the clouds are not economic tools or economic goods.
wait, where does it specifically say discuss buying water from the water company? What are you talking about?
Well, I mean, that's just kind of obvious. When I think about economic goods, I don't think about clouds or rain.
I mean, yes, I understand where
You
you're getting at, but
don't
wouldn't you-
purchase anything unless it's from the water company.
Yeah, but wouldn't you invest to, say, get oil out of the ground or mine certain minerals?
Oil is a commodity because it's bought in exchange for money,
And you can't buy and exchange water?
not the water in the river.
Thank you, Brad.
All right, so as my partner stated, it's been over there that I'm going to be addressing the disadvantage and the first two advantages. And the order I'm going to be going in is the advantages and then the disadvantage. So then I'll be ending with an overview of the round so far. So if everyone's ready then. All right, then let's begin. So starting off, looking at advantage one, first of all, they dropped the alternate cause of deforestation, which is an extremely important thing in this round today. Furthermore, they're functionally non-responsive to the agriculture turn on this. That depleting water from the agricultural sector is actually a massive problem since they use the most. Furthermore, specifically on this is that this irrigation programs incentivize development, which does not necessarily mean expanding farmland. It just means that developing farmland in general states nothing about expanding what they can already do. So them trying to spike out of it, don't buy that. More on this from New York Times 2013. Millions of dollars in farm subsidies for irrigation equipment aimed at water conservation have led to more water use, not less, threatening vulnerable aquifers and streams. Water tables have fallen because the subsidies give farmers the incentive to irrigate more acres of land. The Environmental Quality Incentives Program is supposed to help farmers buy more efficient irrigation equipment, sprinklers, and pipelines to save water. New irrigation systems have not helped conserve water supply, studies show, and researchers believe that the new equipment may be speeding up the depletion of the groundwater supplies, which are crucial to agriculture and source of drinking water. A study by researchers at the University of California concluded that Kansas farmers who received payments under their conservation subsidy were using some of the water savings to expand irrigation to grow thirstier crops, not to reduce consumption. Another study by researchers at New Mexico State University in 2008, which studied an area running from Colorado to New Mexico, came to the same conclusion. Policies aimed at reducing water applications actually increase water depletions. So once again, they also did not address the whole thirstier crops issue. All they can deal with is expanding use of farmland, which means that you can't have a bigger farm in the future, which is also on face absurd because it allows for no growth of the farming sector outside of its current boundaries, leading to stagnation in the economy. So now moving on to advantage two. First of all, the impact for this advantage that they were talking about comes from a disease that can in fact spread. Solving for this one river and claiming it's going to be stopping this disease from killing anyone else is on face absurd. Clearly, if these mosquitoes exist other than just in this one river, they're going to still cause a problem you can't solve for them elsewhere, especially since mosquitoes can fly, which means that they can obviously move the disease, and the disease itself can even spread. So there's no reason to believe that they'd actually be decreasing anything by dealing with one river between Mexico and Texas. Furthermore, when they talk about a 25% increase, they're not actually talking about 25% more water for use by farmers. They're talking about 25% more cubic feet of water per second, which is really just the flow of the Rio Grande by taking care of these invasive species. There's no reason to believe that dealing with this, by increasing the flow of the river in the Rio Grande, that this would actually increase the amount of water flowing into aquifers. It would actually make more sense. It would decrease the amount going in because it would be flowing faster and therefore not have time to soak into the ground as well. So now, moving off of this to the disadvantage of politics. First of all, currently how the plan is unpopular that we talked about how Texas would prefer this. First of all, prefer our specific evidence over their analytics. Another politics link on this was that Texas backlash against Mexico now over water. The plan makes it worse in March 2013. The same South Texas interests are pressing the U.S. elected officials to address the water problem. Those officials are feeling the pressure. The state's 2 Republican senators filed a bill in the Senate calling Mexico to adhere to its obligations under a 1944 treaty. A similar bill was filed in the House. More on this, water issues are inherently contentious for McNeil in 2012. This card is specifically talking about, from farmers in California duking out over water rights with growing urban populations in Middle Eastern countries squabbling over access to rivers and underground reservoirs, the need for water often leads to conflict. Policy and politics make water issues contentious. In the past, we have focused on the social side or the natural side of water. We make regulations or build a dam. We are seeing in the book they're coupled and contentiously being spun by the politics of the Times of Islam, who is also professor of water diplomacy at the Fletcher School. This specifically states that building things, such as a dam, still is politically contentious, which is what their plan is doing. So, also on this, if their plan achieves any solvency whatsoever, they need to make concessions to the country that's giving us trouble with water for decades. This is another huge link magnifier. By conceding to Mexico, who has been causing us these problems, that's going to cause even more political backlash. Also, they still haven't brought up anything about why the minimum wage is linked to CIR in any way. They're completely separate bills, so that really is non-responsive when they talked about that. So as for these impacts around, they talk about death and suffering a lot in their last speech. However, death and suffering is also achieved on the negative side through our case turns. So furthermore, don't buy linearity on that impact. There really is no direct link between irrigation and death that's actually quantifiable. So I can only see a negation for today's round. Thank you.
You got 426. Got 237.
All right, for roadmap, this will be T, the TA, then onto solvency, and then advantages. All right, Judge, sir. Fun, sir. All right, starting with topicality, first of all, on their first interpretation, they don't have a definition for what is environmental and what isn't, so they fail on their own standards of right, line, and abuse. Furthermore, topicality is about whether the direct mandates of the plan are topical, that means they need to address whether funding irrigation is topical, whether removing invasive species isn't topical. Instead, they're just throwing out the word environmental and saying that we fall under it without any warrants. So they lose on their own standards. Furthermore, irrigation is a capital investment. It's an investment to the means of production. That means irrigation investment is not environmental. Furthermore, none of their violations have anything to do with our case because they all refer to water rights. Notice that none of their violations refer to anything the case does. You cannot vote neg on topicality if their violations do not relate to the case. Also, economic engagement is the means, not the ends. You're evaluating the mandates. It doesn't matter if we happen to affect mosquitoes, but just to end here, T isn't just about reading a bunch of different interpretations. Topicality is about using standards to figure out which is the best one. Since they're reading multiple interps, we can concede that their second interp is the best because we meet their second interp, which is about integrating economies with Mexico. Well, that's what we're doing because it's a joint project that affects both our economies. We're both investing, and we're both working on an issue that literally ties our countries together. So we can concede that their second interp is the best. We meet it. Now onto the DA. All right, my partner on uniqueness, he did two things. First, he said that minimum wage wouldn't pass. That was unfortunate. But the second thing he said was that CIR won't pass in the status quo, and that does matter. And they dropped the uniqueness response, and they can't bring it back up. So that takes that point. At the point where there's no uniqueness, the impacts and the links on this don't matter. Now on to solvency for the case. They made a big deal about how we need to provide numbers about how much things cost. Well, I'll just do that quickly. Irrigation systems typically cost around 500 to 1,500 per acre. We're spending 15 billion. That's a lot of money. Now, on Mexico says yes. They're just misinterpreting our card. It says that both sides will work together for the purpose of improved water management, and in the past they've successfully overcome the cultural, legal, administrative, and infrastructural disparities. It doesn't just say that they have to, it says that they have in the past and that they will continue to do so. Now on Mexico won't deliver water, this doesn't relate to the case because the 1944 treaty releases Mexico from obligations in case of extreme drought. White 2009. The treaty stipulates that the U.S. allows 1.5 million acre-feet of Colorado River to flow from the U.S. into Mexico. The treaty releases Mexico from meeting its obligations in cases of extraordinary drought. So Mexico isn't failing on its obligations to deliver water. Furthermore, our solvency doesn't depend on these water deliveries. We're doing irrigation and removal of invasive species. Either way, when we remove these species and when we do the irrigation in the United States or in Mexico, the water flows downstream. That helps both the United States and Mexico, regardless of what either country does on water deliveries. So Mexico delivering water isn't the key to our solvency. It's just an advantage because they can see that we make it possible for Mexico to deliver water when they can see that the salt cedar is the reason that they can't deliver the water. Also, there are other responses. They said that drip and surge irrigation are the same, but they're not. Drip irrigation delivers directly to the roots. Surge irrigation is just flooding, but more selective as to which areas. Now, onto Advantage 1, the turns, because these are all that matter now in the round. Senate Amendment 1049. The Secretary may provide payments under the subsection to a producer for water conservation or irrigation practices that promote ground and surface water conservation on the agricultural operation of the producer through improvements to the irrigation systems and the production of less water-intensive agricultural commodities. So Senate Amendment 1049 addresses water-intensive crops. Now, the reason this is important is because the only offense left in the round is these turns on irrigation, on efficient irrigation, but you need to look at the actual warrants in their cards because all of their warrants depend on farmers cultivating more land or planting more water-intensive crops. But because we're complying with this Senate amendment, that means we're not linking to any of these warrants and we're not linking to any new development. So their turns, which are the only offense left in the round, flow af. And furthermore, even if water savings are being used to grow crops, that still solves for famine. So now on Advantage 3, you can extend that one life still matters. And since they have no offense, vote aye.
Neg, 346. seconds. Prep time has expired.
All right, the order is going to be topicality, then the politics disadvantage, solvency, agriculture, and the other advantages, diseases and water wars, and then maybe a bit of weighing the round. Everybody ready? John and Albert? All right, let's begin. On topicality, they say that we don't give a definition for what's environmental. They didn't answer our argument about how that's infinitely regressive, and at some point we need to be reasonable about evaluating the meaning of words and how we can't just keep defining every single thing. It's unreasonable for us to have to define what's environmental when their plan clearly is in the interest of environmental ends. And they say that the issue is about means, not ends, and because they allow for money, they can do whatever they want with that money. However, this prevents us from being able to evaluate what kind of engagement it is. So even though that may be true in a technical sense, in the context of debate, it makes us unable to evaluate limits, which means that we can't, which means that it justifies abuse against the negative team, against the negative team. They also say that we've been talking about water rights. That's just in the analytics. We've been using that word among other words, but our evidence still excludes their case, which is primarily about the environment as opposed to economic integration, things like trade and exports and imports. On the standards, they do no work on standards. We explain why our interpretations are better because of things like bright lines. We clearly delineate the difference between what's topical and what's not topical, and also intent to define, which their cards don't have, and they don't talk about ground or limits. So you have to prefer our interpretations over theirs, even if you didn't buy them first, because they didn't do the work to prove to you that their interpretations were better. If you buy that as long as you spent money, you're topical, it's impossible for the negative team to be prepared against every case that allows for, and to have good arguments against it. Moving on to politics, their card that they read against us on uniqueness said that there's opposition by Republicans in the GOP. They said that because we didn't touch this, that you can't let us bring it back up. We're not going to bring it back up and try to dispute that claim. We can concede that claim because it still doesn't clash with what our card said. Although there might be GOP opposition, the moderate members of the GOP, the Democrats, and John Boehner, who are the major players, give enough votes to the bill to allow it to pass. So obviously there's a big risk, at least, of the standards. If at worst case scenario, it's just a war of evidence between the two of us. So once you extend our card and see that theirs don't really respond, you can see that we get this impact of $1.5 trillion over 10 years, which obviously massively outweighs case because that puts a humongous strain on the US economy. Moving on to solvency, they say that both sides will want to work together and overcome because we've done that in the past. That was non-responsive to our claim about why Mexico will say no, because they need to prove that Mexico thinks it's worth it to invest in their share of the funding that actually needs to go into the plan. So we don't need a card saying that Mexico doesn't think it's worth it. That was their burden. They're planning to be prima facie, and they have the burden of proof to show that Mexico is willing to spend the money on it, regardless of whether or not they're willing to hold hands with us. On the Mexico, whether or not they're giving us enough water or not, this argument was a double bind. So if their plan doesn't address this, which is how they get out of it, they're unable to solve a major alternate cause to solvency. If Mexico withholds the water from us, we're not able to achieve solvency, at least on the US side of the border. Pull through our evidence that talks about how Mexico has been withholding a certain amount of water and giving a deficit to Texas. They say that Mexico has been complying, but clearly our evidence with empiric examples from multiple sources says that it hasn't. Talking on the issue of alternate causes on solvency in general, deforestation means they can't solve erosion. They still didn't do enough work on this. They can't solve for that alternate cause. And although they mentioned the whole thing about governance and institutional problems, and another argument, they didn't show how they're able to overcome this as a barrier to solvency. At the point where they're unable to solve for structural problems that prevent us from coordinating and working on this, even if that's not what they're trying to do, it's still what they need to do if they want to solve. On the terms, they say that the bill that they passed prevents them from doing thirstier crops and expanding land. Granted that destroys farms as they can't expand or plant what's viable. That means that if the demand in the economy goes up, they're not able to respond by increasing production or increasing the valuable yields that they have. So while the affirmative plan may increase yields, they're worse yields, and it will destroy the ag sector, which they're trying to support. Also, the drip irrigation term, this is compatible because their surge is just talking about different areas on the farm. Drip irrigation is still the mechanism that would be used. And Texas proves anytime you try to irrigate water, it actually leads to a depletion. We've seen this specifically in Texas. And on agriculture, the development turn still applies, again, crossing applying the turns. So for these reasons, I urge a negative ballot.
That is correct.
So for a roadmap, I'll be starting out with impact analysis, then moving on to topicality, the DISAD, solvency and returns, and then the two advantages that still stand for us. You guys ready? All right, let us begin. So on the impact analysis, judges, I urge you to vote as policymakers in today's round because there's been clearly a lot of clash between the advantages and the disadvantages and what weighs and what doesn't. It means that if we win T, win the DISAD, and negate the turns, the slightest chance of an advantage is still a net benefit over the status quo and a reason to vote for the affirmative. Now on the topicality position, judges on T concede their second T interp, we meet. Now if you look at their second T interp, the tag was EE means policy policies with the goal of changing economic ties in a country. EE policies are strategic integration behavior with the target state. They target to deepen the economic relations to create an economic intersection. They can see, we do this because the river literally ties our two countries together. We're both doing this investment to be able to benefit the entire region and change the economic ties from the system of how Texas hates the Mexicans to a system of both sides benefiting because there is a plentiful amount of water in the region. Now, on the DISAD, they conceded the uniqueness card and the entire links, and also their entire link story is about how Texas is unhappy with water rights management. We are not a water rights management case. Specifically, we invest in water infrastructure such as irrigation and getting rid of these invasive species. Now, whether Mexico gives us water or not is not the point of our case. Even if they aren't giving us water in the status quo, that is not our problem. All we're trying to do is help both sides by increasing the amount of water available on the river. Now, on the solvency, even if Mexico says no, there's no impact in proposing the partnership and getting it rejected. Also, Mexico is withholding water. This doesn't matter, as I said before, because our evidence on the treaty actually shows that Mexico isn't in violation because of the drought. Also, on top of that, they still never refuted the evidence that the Salcedo clogs the Rio Contras, which to the 1944 water treaty must be the channel of delivery. They never refuted this argument. Therefore, Mexico can't send the water down the river because A, it has the drought, and B, the river itself is blocked and water won't actually go down it. Therefore, the whole Mexico link on the DISAD completely flows out of the round. Now, on ag returns, this doesn't mean farmers can't plant more crops for the entirety of their future. Obviously, the amendment only applies for the duration of the farm bill it modifies. We don't link to any terms on development and more land being irrigated or water-intensive crops. Also, drip irrigation doesn't link. Drip irrigation drips water onto roots. Surge irrigation floods the whole fields. These are completely different irrigation systems. And on top of that, don't buy their irrigation arguments. As I said before, all we're doing is trying to replace the old irrigation systems, which are inefficient right now, with the best irrigation technology on the market, which is this new surge irrigation. No matter what they say about how surge irrigation is detrimental to the environment, it's better than whatever we're using now, which depletes the aquifers even more and damages the environment even more, as stated by the ag impact of 70% less water usage, and we help solve for erosion. Now, specifically on erosion, they stated that we can't solve for deforestation. All right, we can concede that we can't solve for deforestation, but even then, it's still mitigation. In the end, we still help erosion with the improved irrigation system, especially in the area where it matters, the farmland. This still accesses the famine argument, as I brought up the card that erosion causes less crop yields, which we solve for. This immediately solves for the death and suffering going on in the entire region right now. Also, as I said before, the Senate Amendment 1049 delinks all of their terms, as we don't give we don't give money to the farmers if they specifically do water-intensive crops or expand and etc. On the water wars advantage, the other advantage, the Mennonites are killing people, and even though the overall impact may be hundreds of deaths or maybe even hundreds more suffering, we can help the entire region by helping to solve this unnecessary conflict going on in the north. Clearly, this is a problem as people are actually dying. As I said before, weigh death and suffering above all else, as you cannot put a price on a human life. Therefore, as looking at the advantages, we still have death and suffering for agriculture, as we still have the more efficient irrigation systems. Even no matter how bad this is the best that we have, and this is the best that we will be able to implement, which means that it's better than whatever we're doing in the status quo. And also, the water wars advantage wasn't really attacked very much, and people are dying. And as they have no link on the politics DISAD, as this is all about water rights management, and as we said, we meet their second interrupt of topicality, I can see no reason except for an affirmative ballot in today's round.